So we should be live on the LinkedIn airwaves. And as ever, if we're not, Katie and Zoe, we're just going to have a good old conversation amongst ourselves. But yes, welcome to this month's edition of the Contact Center Network. It literally is coming up to like 5 years since we started this. And we started it in lockdown, and we are on like the 5-year anniversary of lockdown, aren't we? So we're pretty much to the day live to your airwaves. But yeah, it's been a roller coaster of 5 years for everybody, and we're on probably about episode 43 or 44 now. So it's a pleasure to be back, and it's very nice to have two special guests, Katie Forsyth and Zoe Thompson. And I'm not going to steal their thunder and do any intros because they can introduce themselves better than I can. So I'm going to hand over to Katie and give us an introduction, Katie. Let people know who you are, what you're famous for, and any useful information.
This is going to be quick.
Infamous.
Hi, everybody. My name is Katie Forsyth. I am MD of a business called Red Recruitment. We're a contact centre recruitment specialist across the UK. But I think probably more importantly for today, I spend a great deal of my time doing consultancy in the industry for people consultancy, specifically looking at agent wellbeing, agent health, and agent retention and engagement. So hopefully I can bring something valuable to the party.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for joining us. It's good Pleasure. To have you back. Zoe, tell the viewers and the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So thank you for having me on as a guest. It's good to be here. So I am a coach and trainer, and I help people with tools, strategies, mindset, confidence for success in life, leadership and business. So I work with organizations in particular around leadership, coaching, support, but also with the soft skills, behavior skills for them to have high performing and successful teams. And I also work with business owners that are setting out on their own and getting themselves started up. So good combination. It's a real mix of people. But in terms of today, to add some context, I worked for Avon and Somerset Police for 20 years. I was there when they first started the contact centre. So when I first started, it was a handheld phone on the desk. There was no call centre. Yeah, that's how long ago it was. And then as the call demand picked up, I was involved in the first what they called bringing in some volunteers and some people to answer the phones, and then that then built into the contact centre that we have today. So yeah, that's my background in terms of context for what we're talking about.
And that's some very good context. Thank you very much, Zoe. Nice to have you on the episode, on the show. And today we are talking about how we can help contact center folk build resilience in their teams and really help them think about what an employee well-being strategy needs to be. Specifically when we talk about, I suppose, remote and hybrid, because that's where we see some of the biggest challenges in well-being and in that level of resilience. And we've gone through 5 years of, are we in the office? Are we out of the office? And I don't think we've necessarily landed on the right answer or if there is a right answer, but we're starting to see a shift of people being asked to move back to the office now. So that's going to require us to have a bit of a mental shift. It's going to require us to have a bit of a mindset shift. So we thought it would be useful to have this discussion and just talk about some of the things that might be impacting resilience in our teams and impacting people's mental health and well-being, and share some top tips and suggestions of what we're seeing across the industry and what we've seen as lived experience of leaders. But as ever, this is an interactive affair. So if you are watching on your mobiles, or if you're watching on your desktop and you drop a comment into the chat that's on this live, I can show it a little bit like this. Here's one I prepared earlier, and we can fire a question or fire your comment to somebody on the panel. So if you have a burning topic and you are shouting at the screen and feel very passionately about it, please do feel free to share, and please let us know as well where you're viewing this from. We love to know where the furthest places that people are dialing from. We've had the Philippines before, we've had the US. We've had all sorts of spaces. So it's good to know where people are watching this from. But I'm going to kick off with an opening, Katie, around what the current landscape is in the contact center, and what you are maybe seeing as some of the biggest challenges currently with remote and hybrid contact centers, and how are they facing off to mental well-being and resilience challenges. So what's your observations of what's happening in the market, Katie? And then Zoe, I'll ask for your input as well.
Okay, thanks. So there's a definite swing towards coming back into the office. There's obviously the big headlines of the big employers, and as soon as JP Morgan and so on go, and some of the really big employers go, then we all feel more confident to do that. There's a definite swing going back. I'd say 3 days office, 2 days home is a pretty usual sit now. Interestingly, we definitely feel, and you see in the marketplace, that the biggest resilience to that is the managers, which we'd expect, because they're the ones with nice home gardens and more responsibilities that they like to balance their lifestyle with. And it's not the agents. In fact, we definitely feel the agents pushing to be back more. The reasons for coming back, without any doubt, are led by productivity as opposed to well-being. Everyone is absolutely talking about well-being, because we should and we have to. But when you lift the bonnet of actually what's driving the decision of bringing people back, it's of course the productivity and the bottom line, and getting that back on track. So I'm expecting this year, and certainly from the piece of work that I'm doing at the moment, is very much a drive back into the office, but the harder people to get there are the managers, for sure.
Yeah. And Zoe, are you seeing similar trends there in some of the conversations that you're having with clients across your business?
Yeah, I work with different industries, but I would say it's still very, very similar to what Katie's just described there. So three days at home, 2 days in the office. And the conversation is around well-being and support, whereas, and again, lift the bonnet, and a lot of it is around productivity, although you speak to the individuals, and some individuals will tell you they are more productive when they are at home and able to create a schedule that fits in around their other priorities. I think one of the things that has come up, certainly at the start of COVID, and the conversation has continued since then, we know that one of the biggest causes of burnout is the mismatch of the levels of support. It's the mismatch of values. It's the mismatch of that sense of community and sense of belonging. And I think although the technology moved very, very quickly in terms of being able to support businesses online, that picked up really, really quickly. The actual human behavior to support that and still provide what being in a workplace is like, that sense of community, those conversations that happen quite naturally in an office, that level of support, or being able to see who needs support when it's not necessarily said out loud. There's a lot of that hasn't been replaced, or we haven't found a way to be able to replace that. So I think that's where a lot of people want to come back into work. They want those conversations, and online is great. It's very efficient. It's a very effective way of working. You dial into the meeting starts straight away. When the meeting is finished, the meeting is done. You don't have those conversations as everybody comes into the meeting room and sits around the table, or is able to see. Quite often, if cameras are not on as well, we're not able to see how people are and how people are responding. We're not able to see that body language. So I think there are lots of elements that are missed, that although the technology has replaced, the human behavior element hasn't found a way forward with it, which I think is why there are still some people that want to come back in.
Yeah. And you know what, I think we touched on a point that you made there, Katie, around leaders and leaders being a little bit more resistant to wanting to come back in. But with all the leaders that we've got in the business, they all tend to have teams, and those teams then talk, and they need the support, and they need the help. And I suppose the question I would frame is to say, what actually is the role of leadership in well-being, and what do you think leaders can do or are doing to actively support the mental well-being of their teams when they are at odds with, I suppose, the location where they want to work and where their team work?
Yeah. I'll be interested. And Zoe's thoughts on this as well. But for me, we've got a really unique challenge in the contact center industry, in that nearly all of our team leaders are millennials and nearly all of our agents are Gen Zs, and they are very differently hardwired and they need very different things. But unfortunately, millennials think that Gen Zs are just like them. So millennials are generally trying to lead a Gen Z like they would have liked to have been led themselves. And they think a Gen Z wants what they want. And in reality, they want totally different things. And so we've got this really difficult situation where we've got leaders, I think, doing what they think is inherently the right thing to do, but agents kicking back off that. So for me, as an industry, and a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is on exactly this, as an industry, we've got to understand the difference in what those generations want, need, that how they're underpinned in their hardwiring. And then if our team leader base, particularly team leaders, they have such a massive impact at the moment. If that team leader base can get more with the program of those agents, then we solve a lot of our issues. And one of the big difference there is where they want to work.
And you've got that dilemma, haven't you? Is that maybe the teams are wanting to come back on site and they're wanting to do more, but their managers and their leaders are resistant to that. So they can't build that connection with the leadership team. Therefore, they become more disengaged.
And who do they learn off? You know, who do the new agents learn off? Where are they being coached from? And where are they getting their camaraderie from? When we all started our careers on the phones, what did we love about it? It wasn't dealing with customers. It was making our friends who were other agents. That's what we loved about our industry. That's why we are an industry of choice and always have been, because of our camaraderie. And I'm not saying there's not a place for hybrid. Absolutely not saying that. There's definitely a place for it. But we have to get leaders and agents on similar pages. At the moment, we're working completely separately.
And Zoe, interested in your thoughts on the role of leadership in wellbeing then, and what the emotional aspect of leadership is, and some of the pressures that maybe leaders are coming under. What's your take on the role that leaders have to play in a remote or hybrid environment?
I think it's a real challenge, because a lot of, if we look at what leadership is, it's influencing and guiding. So it's really hard to do that when you're not visible. That doesn't mean that you're not contactable. It doesn't mean that you're not there being supportive. But if you are not in the room for people to observe and be influenced by, then it's a real challenge. And I think with wellbeing in particular, we know that teams that have good levels of well-being often have a team leader or a manager who prioritizes their own well-being, and they lead by example. So they take their breaks, they go out and get some fresh air, they finish on time, they prioritize and time management and encourage their teams to do the same. So again, that's very difficult to manage from a distance. Not impossible, but it can be more of a challenge. But also, we need to understand, as Katie's just been saying, what the younger generations want, what's important to them, what they prioritize is very different to the older generations. And so what if they're looking up to see what other people are doing, it might not necessarily mirror what it is they want for themselves. So they're very much values centered. They will make their decisions around their values. They hold their values very strong. We see that especially since COVID, not just in terms of where they spend their money, but also where they earn their money. So we know the younger generations are not just picking companies because I can earn all of this money. They're picking companies that align with their values, align with that sense of purpose and social responsibility. So that comes into well-being as well. I have conversations with leaders, with managers who feel that sense of frustration that and it's a hard conversation, because on one level, they absolutely respect that they're putting family members first, they're putting their well-being first. And I think there's almost a part of them that slightly is jealous that they are able to do that without that sense of fear of judgment, that they stand so strongly to their principles and by what they feel is important. Whereas I think those of us who perhaps started working like me, say in the 90s, that just wasn't the thing. You didn't talk about home at work. You didn't talk about work at home. There was a very clear divide, very clear boundaries. And I think for the younger generations coming in, that divide is not there. And especially with remote working as well, your work is in your home and your home is in your work. So again, there's so many things that have come into the mix. It makes those conversations more challenging, again, not impossible, more challenge, but so much more around the individual. I think the conversations for leaders now is not just what the team wants, it's what do my 10 individuals within the team want, because the values will be very different, the priorities will be very different, what good looks like will be very different. So I think we just need to be talking a lot more. I mean, I will always argue that communication is often the answer to most problems that we have, but we do need to be having more conversations.
And I think you've touched on some really good points there. And I think when we start to think about individuals in the teams and how individuals are feeling, they all go through the change curve differently. They all recover from things differently, and they all have different pressures outside of the house, outside of work, outside of the house that they might want to share. And a lot of that leads to burnout. And I think what's interesting here is Katie Lehman has popped into the chat, and it's as if she knew what my next question was going to be, because she's talking about an extremely large proportion of society are burnt out, disconnected, and they don't know how to manage their own emotions, or they don't know how to regulate well. And the question I had for you, Katie, to start with was, how do we prevent burnout in remote teams? Because you've got remote and hybrid work, and that can blur the lines between work and personal life. So what strategies have you seen that are helping reduce agents' propensity to burnout? And I'm particularly interested in that from a younger generation, the Gen Z gens, because I think they're the ones that are at highest risk.
Yeah, Katie, I love your comment. I totally agree. How can we help them? You know, they've got to self-start helping, but the twist in that tale is this is the generation. Gen Zs are the best at helping themselves with mental health. That's why it's so headline at the moment, because they've brought it to the headlines and they are not scared to address it. So we as leaders have to work out how we go about helping them, because they're happy to address it. But to answer your question, Gary, so we know that workplace job satisfaction is at a 20-year low. It's never been lower I've been in contact center recruitment for 30 years. It's only been lower once before. And mental health is the worst that it's been since World War II. So as leaders, we've got a pretty difficult job on our hands getting engagement to where contact centers would love our engagement to be, because that's what we love. And we also know that the Gen Z population are the most detached generation from business and from workforces. They will not sell their soul. They are the best agents we've ever had, because they've had more emotional life experience to deal with than any other generation before them that's been monitored, obviously. And so they are brilliant at helping, and they are, without a doubt, the best customer people you will find. But they will not sell their soul like the millennials or the Gen X's will, because they don't trust business. So we're fighting a tide there as leaders. Disengaged workforces, mental health problems like we've never seen before, and agents that, quite frankly, if they get fed up, they'd rather not have a job than one they don't enjoy. So we're really good at that. We're leading in that as an industry at finding solutions for that. So some brilliant agent assist technology out there, which is absolutely aimed at Gen Z and is outstanding, which turns our monitoring into coaching, which is exactly where we need to be. Stop monitoring, let's let AI monitor and let's coach. Some amazing engagement initiatives for home working people, which involves more shrinkage, but the more shrinkage pays for itself than the reduced attritions. And there's definitely data to back that up.
All the resource planners watching are like, what?
I know, but you'll be surprised how much, well, you'll work with them as well, Gary, resource planners that go, actually, we're not using all the shrinkage that we need to, because we're so behind on our resource models or whatever. So there's ways that we can get clever shrinkage in, for sure, and we absolutely need it in this environment. But I'm not saying let's be less productive. On the contrary, because it will return in reduced attritions, and all the data says so. And we could go on, but for me, agent assist, engagement initiatives, and that let's look at our shrinkage models and how to use them appropriately.
Yeah, I really like that you're bringing in agent assist there, and I think what I'm certainly seeing in the marketplace because of introductions of AI is getting a stronger and tighter knowledge base that can support agents better as well.
Absolutely.
Zoe, from your point of view, what do you see in kind of how we help leaders support teams to reduce that level of burnout? What are the types of things that you observe?
I think from conversations that I've had with people, I think understanding what the cause of the burnout is always going to be the most important thing. I think a lot of people assume that burnout is resource related. So either too much work to do, not enough people, or not enough time. Whereas actually, the mismatch of values is probably the leading cause of burnout for our younger people, because they feel so strongly that actually when it is misaligned, if they've got a leader with different values, or they're working for an organization with different values, that can be a real challenge. And whereas I think perhaps the older generations, we would have just chalked it down and said, well, that's it. That's how work is. That's just adulting now. You just got to get used to it. We've got younger generations who, we haven't given them that society that tells them that things are permanent. I joined the police. That was a career for life. That's what I thought. I mean, ultimately, I was made redundant, so it wasn't a career for life for me. But I went in with that intention that you made your decision in school, and that was it. We have got this younger generation who, a lot of them were doing exams, didn't know if exams were going to happen. We're looking at universities, didn't know if universities were going to happen. They're not seeing job security. So why would they sign up and put life on the line for an organization that can't make them any promises? Because that's the way of the world. There isn't any industry now where it's a job for life. So they're not coming into the working world to see a job for life. They're looking for work that fits nicely and aligns nicely and is it's fulfilling for them. But actually, there's a lot of people that the term flat living, they will make adjustments to how they live so that they don't have to do 80-hour weeks and earn 80 grand a year. They'll adjust how they live to accommodate that. So we have to take that into consideration into those conversations. What good looks like for them, what well-being is for them, is going to be very different. And there is often a sense of judgment that we have to work through of what we think should be important and why don't they see that as important. And quite often hear the term lazy or disengaged or disinterested, and it's not that. It's just they show up differently, their behaviors are different, we're just applying a different interpretation to them. So I think we need more understanding, we need more empathy, and we need to listen more. And I think the more we get to know the individuals, the more we get to be able to understand and increase that level of awareness, and the more we can then support them in the way that they want to be supported, not the way we think they want to be supported.
Can I just add to that, just really briefly, Gary, because I know you want to move on, just really quickly. I don't think we should talk about burnout without recognising that the industry has changed beyond recognition. In terms of, I was with someone from is long-standing in the industry last week, and she was saying, I used to go to the pub every lunchtime. I used to have an hour out, and I used to have 2 glasses of wine at lunch, and come back. Can you imagine if our agents did that now? And my bosses would have long leisurely lunch times and go out for long. That just doesn't happen anymore. And these agents are bouncing all the technologies, take all the stuff we know about without being boring, transactional stuff out, really complex after complex, with no long lunches in the pubs with their mates. It's a different world. We can't say they're burning out because they're differently hardwired. The whole dynamic of work has changed.
Yeah. And you know what, you lead me nicely into what we call, or what we're referring to here, is employee vulnerability. And we talk a lot about vulnerability in the contact center industry, and quite often we view it through the lens of a customer. But what I don't think we do enough is identifying and joining up the dots of vulnerable customers are also employees. Absolutely. Somewhere. So we've got a whole nation of vulnerable agents, and we've got a whole nation of vulnerable customers, and we've got vulnerable leaders managing vulnerable employees who are dealing with vulnerable customers. And I think we could do better, and what I think we need to empower leaders to do, and to empower agents to do, is be more open to what those vulnerabilities are. So my question, and I'll start with you, Katie, is what do you see as some of maybe the most common signs that a remote or hybrid employees struggling with either their well-being or their resilience levels, and how should that employee and that leader and that organization wrap their arms around their employees so that they are less likely to burn out and less likely to be vulnerable?
So vulnerability is huge. I think it's going to be the big theme of the year for us, looking after our vulnerable agents. Forget customer vulnerability. For me, it's all about agent vulnerability. And I don't see there's any great difference between remote and office-based, bricks and mortar vulnerable agents. And certainly not much difference in how we should go about considering dealing with those. What I will say is vulnerability comes from 4 or 5 different key threads. And one of those, and the one that's causing the greatest vulnerability, as we all know, is debt. And there's still the pressure on debt for our agents. And you will have something like listen to me, I'm so boring. 57% of Gen Z agents will have a second income because they have to have, and they will be burning out because they're doing more than one job and they're worrying about their bills. And to give you some tangibles on that, the average agent in the UK earns £24,165 at the moment. It's going to go up. We're just doing the April figures now. It's going to tip over the 25 mark for April, as we all know. If you are earning that much money a year, you are taking home, and I prepared this because I'm doing this for a client at the moment, £1,743 a month net. If you're taking home £1,700 a month net, and you live in, like Rachel, Zoe and I do, like you live in Bristol, and you're paying £1,200 as a minimum rent a month, if you don't live with bank of mum and dad, then you've got your bills, and then you've got your food. That is why, and the data absolutely evidences this. A standard agent, if all they did was be an agent, is going into £350 extra debt month on month on month. And there's our vulnerability. And then we're asking them to deal, in a lot of cases, with collections, debt control, really, really tough calls. So we have to be really mindful that we are an entry-level, minimum wage, minimum salary industry. And I can come to you and earn £24,500, or I can go and work in a cocktail bar serving really happy customers who are giving me huge tips. Yeah. And so there is a limit to how much, it doesn't matter what generation they are, how much this worker will take for that salary.
And I think that's a really interesting, when you express those numbers in that way, it makes you realize actually it's why there is a hustle culture. Yeah.
Any senior leader who's looking at their attrition to work out what the net salary is and do that job for 2 days. And again, I'm passionate. If I go to my grave with one legacy, this is an industry of choice, and we need to get great talent into it. But we make our lives pretty difficult with our expectations. And I'm not one for increasing salaries, but let's make the engagement better, and let's give them the shrinkage and the coaching they need and the support.
And what's your views on that, Zoe? Because I think we talk about resilience in teams. We talk about people overcoming adversity, and all of that stuff makes them more prone, I suppose, to taking more on their shoulders and becoming more burnout and becoming more vulnerable. So what's your thoughts on how we help leaders and organizations address employee vulnerability, and maybe what some of the contributory factors are that you're seeing?
I think exactly what Katie has just described is such a real challenge, because ultimately the conversation is always what's the employer's responsibility and what's the employee's responsibility. And whenever I'm talking to leaders, running workshops or whatever, I'm always talking about how, as a leader, as an employer, you've got a duty of care, but also as individuals, we have a duty of responsibility to look after ourselves. The challenge is certainly some of the things that Katie's describing there, there's a very small level of control that people have over that, which is why people have to get second incomes. But ultimately, you're talking about what creates chronic stress. It's not the acute stress that call handlers are great at dealing with, because they'll have a stressful call, or they'll have a difficult call. Their stress levels go up, the adrenaline, the cortisol, they deal with it. They've got the mindset that they know they've got the resources, the capability to be able to deal with it, so they see it as a challenge rather than as a threat. They deal with it well, and then they regulate back down to that neutral state. That's what, as humans, we're designed to deal with. We are not designed to have this low level of worry about how can I pay my bills? How can I put food on the table? How can I do 2 jobs and still get enough sleep and be able to do both jobs well, so that I'm not under a performance plan because I'm showing up tired and I don't have energy and I'm making mistakes. So I think we've got the challenge here that we've got situations outside of work that are creating chronic stress, that is bringing problems into work that workplaces have to support and deal with. We've also got the challenge that externally we know that actually waiting list times, being able to get support for some of these things is very limited. So again, we've got responsibility coming to workplaces to provide that level of support. So again, some things that people would much prefer to keep private, I'm sure they wouldn't want to come in and have to tell their boss that they're in lots of debt and they're struggling, but they have to, if they're going to get any level of support from the employee assistance programs, or they're going to get that supportive conversation from people that they work with. So there's so many things that come into the melting pot, which some is down to the employee and them desperately trying to make it work and they have to bring into work, and others where do the workplaces take some responsibility to help with that.
And I think you've touched on something really important there, is around how do we allow, or how do we encourage employees to be open and honest with us. And I think certainly when I've done engagement surveys before, and I've said and I've asked questions, and you put those questions in there, is do you trust your manager, is always a good question to get a feeling of the culture of the organization. And I think that's an important part, that we have to create that psychological safe environment. And without psychological safety being a buzzword, it's how do we actually help and create an environment where employees feel comfortable discussing their situations, discussing their mental health challenges, without that fear or stigma of being judged. I'm going to ask you, Zoe, for your thoughts on that first, and then Katie, please add in. But how do we create that environment, Zoe, do you think, in leadership? I
think the fear of judgment is very much an individual thing. I think some people will naturally be more comfortable talking about things and some people won't. I think we've got generations that are coming up through, like you said, they're very comfortable in talking about how they feel and things that they're working on. However, the culture of an organization is really key to this. I think we look at leaders to shape that culture, but actually the culture is how everybody shows up to work. It's the behaviors that we encourage, it's the behaviors that we close down, it's the way everybody shows up. And I think we all have a responsibility within that. Leaders will have that larger circle of influence to be able to challenge and encourage the ones that the behaviors that you want to see for the culture that you want. So I think people pay attention to the conversations that go on day to day. I think how people talk about some of the really important impactive things like debt, unhealthy relationships, the things that people really struggle with, that are less likely to disclose and less likely to come to support for. Those conversations that happen on a day-to-day basis will shape that culture, and that will shape whether or not people feel comfortable in doing that. But I think it's also those elements of what happens when people raise the low-level thing. So say, for example, somebody who's really struggling with their workload, how does that get listened to? How does that get heard? How does that get resolved? Because that will also then shape with, well, if they deal with that like that, then I feel more comfortable, more confident in raising something that feels a little bit more personal, more vulnerable, more serious for me. So I think the culture element, the conversations day to day, the small stuff is really important, because that's what shapes the bigger picture for people.
And Katie, from your perspective there, how do you maybe see that psychological safety or that trust in leadership changing across some of the generations that are in the contact center?
If I become boring on this, you will stop me. So, so if you wind back and look at the generations, and we're gonna generalize about Gen Z here, because they're going to be over 90% of agents by the end of next year. So let's look at Gen Zs. Gen Zs are different to millennials in that they are much more closed with their data. They were born of parents, millennial parents, who thought it was really funky to put photos of them even in the womb on social media without their permissions. So they won't do anything without their permission. So you ask a Gen Z to fill out an engagement survey and they'll probably tell you to naff off, whereas a millennial will tell you what they had for dinner last night. So there's a difference in how those Gen Zs and millennials behave. And although a Gen Z is really happy to say, I've got a problem with my mental health, I'm going to go and care for myself. My mental health is my most important thing and I'm going to care for it. That's what they're great at. What they're not so good at, they will not come in. If they've had a big bust up with their partner last night, they are not coming in and telling you as your team leader. They're closed and guarded with their personal information. A millennial will come in and you will know everything about that argument. You'll know what was said, who walked out of the house first. Millennials love airing their dirty laundry. Gen Z, they'll keep all of that close. So the skill of the team leader, and I agree with Zoe wholeheartedly, is to get to know the individual, because we are generalizing. Right, Peter, how do you like your manager to support you? And it's where America were 5 years ago. It's personalized management. But that's how we've got to be with the Gen Zs, because they want to look a manager in the white of their eyes. They prefer managerial one-on-one conversations, and they want to build a personal but trusting relationship. They don't like team. So we've got to get to know individuals, and if they don't want to share, they don't have to, but we're there to point them in the direction, as Amber's asked, for any EAPs that there are. We're not there to solve all their problems, but we're definitely there to listen.
Definitely. If I can just add a coaching question for leaders that can be really great for that, is to ask at the end of every one-to-one, what am I doing well? That means that I'm being a good manager for you, so that you can really hear specifics of what you're doing that they like. And then an open question, what can I do differently that will help me to be a better manager for you? Because every individual is going to need something different. But if we don't ask the questions, we don't get the answers. And it's a long trial and error process. So it's just much easier to ask that open question.
Yeah. And you know what? I think you've raised a really valid point there, because I don't necessarily think we always support leaders to be comfortable to be able to ask that question, or to have the coaching skills to be able to deal with what comes out of that without getting a little bit defensive. So I think the point you're making around leadership capability and leadership investment, I think is really important as part of this whole conversation. But I want to touch on Amber's question here that's come into the chat, and just think about some of the case studies, perhaps, Katie, that you've seen within some of the organizations that you've worked with, which might help give Amber some guidance on some things that she could use with her team.
Oh, I knew you were going to come to me for this. And Amber, I'm not going to answer your question here, because I see so many of them. And I don't want to nail my muscle. I don't want to.
Commit, Katie. Commit.
No, I don't want to. Can we take that offline, though? What I would say, Amber, is what I definitely see, without telling you the one or two that I would definitely say employees and agents engage with, that, and forgive me, anyone who's involved in this on the call, they're all much of a muchness. But what we do, what some do well and some do badly, is how we promote them internally and how we make our workers aware of the programs that we have available. I was doing some consultancy for a client last week, looking at contact center engagement, and they had some things on their engagement in employee assistance programs, which were fantastic, and no one that in the agent population knew about them. No one was telling them. They get bombarded with really intense 4-week training, and as part of that, we go, this is what we give you in the EAP. And so I would say the difference is not really the provider, but how well organizations communicate out what you have available to your workers. We spend a lot of money on it. Let's broadcast it.
And thinking specifically on that point, Katie, because you mentioned around the Gen Zs and their protectiveness around their own personal situations. When you have programs like EAPs and stuff in place, there is a general feeling maybe that it's being monitored. So how do we, I suppose, ensure that the information that they're doing it anonymously, and they've got that right to anonymize their concern?
Yeah, that's such a key point. It's the same on if you're doing engagement reports. If you're asking for any feedback from a Gen Z, you have to stress it's anonymous, or ask them if they want to put their name to it. I can't tell you how to do it. I would just say when you're writing out to them on everything, and most really intuitive sites now stress it because everyone knows this generational stuff. But just whenever your HR or people teams are working with your people, at every point you can to increase the amount of response that you're getting or engagement in something, stress the anonymity.
Yeah.
You're testing me today on words like that. I know. I'm full of cold. Sorry, by the way. I'm drinking. I'm sniffling. So sorry about that.
And Zoe, I want to pull the other aspect of training into this, because I think whilst there are programs that people can do and these EAPs that you've got, we are very good in the contact center industry of creating programs that people can go and do training, and we might have mental health first aiders, but we still have quite an issue with employees' vulnerability and employees feeling that they don't have an outlet. So where do tools like mental health first aid and training help in maybe helping us make that shift and make that change?
I think the more individual, the more solutions that are individual, like focused on the individual, have a much better response. I know we don't like the term, sheep dipping or conveyor belt, but I think any wellbeing strategies or sessions that people feel like they're just being moved through and it's like a regurgitated information tend not to land very well. Most people see it as a tick in the box exercise. I think certainly from my experience, the ones that are most engaged with and the ones where people feel like it's most beneficial are where it's more focused around the individual. So it's difficult because it's not the most cost-effective way to do it in terms of your outlay. It's much easier to put people in a room together. I think even in smaller groups, you can have more individual conversations, but actually the return of the investment of that time and giving them that support actually often balances out what the investment is. Appreciate I'm slightly biased being in the coaching industry, because I would say that you can send somebody on a week-long training course and there's probably 2 or 3 modules within that week-long course that are the things they need to hear, whereas with coaching we can get to the bottom of the root, the root thing that they need to work on and support that on a one-to-one basis. But I think people need to be heard. It goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about. People want to be heard. They want to be listened to. The research that was done by Deloitte a couple of years ago talked about the disconnect, which was what Katie was talking about. What companies are providing and what employees are saying they need, there is a disconnect. So we need to listen to what people are asking for, as well as having things in place that we as an organization think they also need, and then being able to promote that, to be able to connect the dots, but also being open to doing things a little bit differently. If you've got an individual that needs something that you recognize, or they're telling you that your EAP or your system that you have in place doesn't support, then being open to doing things a little bit differently.
And you know what, from a recruitment perspective, Katie, and I'm seeing a lot of organizations now appoint mental health first aiders, but in the recruitment of a mental health first aider, what do you think are some of the things that organizations should be mindful of when they're making those appointments? Because I see that as quite a crucial role if it's done right, but I think we can sometimes be ticking a box and just appointing people without really vetting them. So what advice would you give people who are going through that assessment?
Rather than advice, I think I'll give you a case study, because it's probably more tangible.
We love a case study.
I'm not going to give you the company name though, but I will tell you they're a European leader. So one of the things that I totally agree with you, Gary, we need to choose carefully who our mental health first aiders are, because the intent has to be correct. And we have to make sure that they're doing it they are skilled to do that job and not doing it just because they like chatting to people and finding out what's going on in everyone's lives. And I was trying to avoid that. You read my mind. I work with someone really closely, and they have high budgets, which helps for sure. But they have recently made the big change to decide to stop all their mental health first aiders, and they are amazing at their staff engagement, by the way, one of the leaders. And rather than have individual mental health first aiders, they've employed 4 skilled, trained psychologists, because they were getting to the point, they have a very large contact centre where they actually found that the mental health first aid program that they had in place caused more time out and more absence because it wasn't being dealt with correctly. And it was actually a lot of gossip going on and a lot of storms in teacups. And they decided they'd take, and it's been a significant investment, over nearly £200,000 a year of salaries worth of investment. But they've done it to really get under the skin of that absence. The absence rates are way too high in our industry, and a lot of it is down to this, as we know. So I would say, I'm not suggesting everyone can afford that, but I would say the moral of the story is there is a link to making sure you are choosing skilled people to be your mental health first aiders, not letting them choose themselves, and then doing that job in a way that we wouldn't want them to.
Brilliant. I think that's a really powerful case study, that. And if anybody else has got any other thoughts on what they do to recruit and assess, feel free to drop it into the comments so that people can share. So any other builds on that?
If I could just jump in on that quickly. I think what we need to remember is that the mental health first aiders were they were designed to help people at crisis point. So they're not there to deal with the problem. They're there to support that individual at that time of crisis, to be able to give them that support. And it was to give them the training so that they knew what to do in that situation. Because we know those situations are going to happen, but they're not trained to help that individual work on what's creating the crisis. And so actually I agree with Katie, and I've seen other companies do this as well. I know one company that brings in a counsellor, for one day a month, and that people can book in sessions with that counsellor. I know EAPs also provide that, but we need to make sure, and organisations need to make sure that that mental health first aider is applying first aid and a triage, and not picking up the solving of the solution of the problem itself longer term. It should be a point of support at crisis and a triage. So I think in what they were designed to do is well intentioned. I think how they are being used is where it's not working.
Yeah, I agree.
And we've got a comment from Ruth Tuthill in the chat, just to say if anybody wants to reach out, Ruth is happy to share some of the techniques that she employs in her business. So my penultimate question, before your top tip, which we'll close on, it's just about the measurement strategies that we've got for measuring resilience and or measuring employee engagement, and understanding, I suppose, what measurement strategies need to be in place to understand how effective your well-being strategy is happening. Now, we love to measure things and put a KPI on everything in the contact center. I suppose my question is it right that we do that? And how do we actually measure and measure the improvement in resilience in contact centers? Katie, what are some of maybe the key indicators that you see that might suggest that we have high levels of resilience, or maybe even a challenge? What's your take on measuring resilience in contact centers?
So everyone knows I love this industry, right? So there's no point in me coming on this podcast or on this with you and saying, yeah, everything's amazing and I love the industry. It's about saying what we do badly. So I'm caveating this by saying I'm going to criticize the industry, but I do love the industry. I think we're really bad at this. I think we add 2 and 2 together and we get to 15, because we say, right, we've got high absence. That means all of our agents are non-resilient. Our customers are vile at the moment. We've got really high occupancy levels. It must be down to the agents being non-resilient. Absolute twaddle, in my opinion. This is the most resilient bunch of agents we have ever had. They're far more resilient than my generation were. So we are measuring, our measures at the moment are really dangerous to our industry, because we're doing that thing of just beating up the most recent generation in the workforce, which we always do. And actually, what we should be looking at is, right, how do we support our most brilliantly resilient agents? Resilience is something that we grow by having access to really difficult situations. No one can argue. These guys have been through a great recession in 2008. Their parents went through hell. Then they went through COVID. They've been through, they've lived only in a post-terrorism world.
Yep.
They are blinking resilient, these people. There's no question of their resilience, but what we have to do is we have to measure it differently, and that is, do we give them the right tools to do it? Do we give them enough downtime to deal with such a highly occupied role? And then let's look at measuring brilliance and productivity and customer experience, and let's not link absence with resilience. That's not resilience. They're absent because they won't sell their soul to you.
And Marianne with us in the chat is echoing that. I think the final comments that she's put there, we just need to be looking at things differently. But as normal, companies jump the gun before looking at the consequence of their actions. And I think that's an important part to say, is that every action that we take has a consequence. And some of the unintended consequences of things that we measure, or some of the assumptions or the judgments that we make, have consequences in themselves. Zoe, what's your thoughts on measuring resilience? And actually, if I can ask you to define resilience first for us, what would you say the definition of resilience is? And then what do you think we need to do as an industry to improve that, or monitor it and measure it? How do we do that?
So our resilience, by definition, is the ability to be able to flex and adapt to the situation as it arises. So I think a lot of people talk about resilience as almost being post-event. How quickly do we recover? How quickly do we regulate? How quickly do we return to a neutral / normal state for us? Whereas actually it's the ability to flex and adapt, which is why I would agree with Katie that actually people who work in call centers are very, very resilient people, not just on the phones with their customers and clients, but actually how quickly they're able to come off one call, snap back in, regulate, and go into that next call. I love my days in the police control room, but it never failed to absolutely blow my mind how quickly people could come off one call, really, really difficult, often horrific calls, and, not even sometimes take that break, just kind of snap back in, and they were on the next call. That was often their way of being able to deal with it, was to be able to go into that next call. So I would agree. I think the resilience, they are very resilient people. I think when we measure up what they are being asked to live with and adapt to, there's certainly a lot more there than I remember at that age. So I think when you first asked the question, before Katie started answering, my immediate reaction was to go to, we need to focus more on solution than the problem. And I think sometimes when we talk about the problem repeatedly, we bring the problem to awareness rather than bringing solutions to awareness. And that can have an impact. We physically, we respond, mentally, we respond. And if you think you're in that generation where people are constantly describing you as lazy, or not resilient, or all of these other words that are used to describe them as a problem, rather than actually talking about what they're doing differently and how they're shaping the future of the world, and actually how they can really influence. I think there is a sweet spot between the old generations and the young generations. We just haven't met in the middle yet, because the world isn't ready for us to meet in the middle yet, because the world is still changing. But I think we focus on the solutions, we focus on what's good, we focus on what people are doing well, we focus on what is working really well, and we do more of that, and then we focus on the solutions for the things that aren't working so well, rather than the problem.
I'd agree with that. And it's interesting, I did a poll just last week ahead of this webinar, asking if do people feel like you can train resilience? 53% of the people that voted, there was nearly 100 people that voted, so 53% of the people that voted said yes, you can train resilience. 35% said no, it's just something you have, and then 12% was in the other camp. So my question to you guys, and I'll start with you, Zoe, is do you feel like resilience can be trained? Is that something that leaders and contact center operations managers can kind of go to the training team and say, hey, write me a course on resilience? Is that something that you can do?
I don't know that it would be a classroom-based course, but I would argue that it's a behavior and therefore it's learned. So yes, for want of a better word, it can be trained. I think a lot of people don't understand what makes them resilient to be able to tap into it. So yes, brilliant. I would agree. It can be. And
what's your thoughts there, Katie? Are you in a similar camp? What, were you part of the 53?
Yeah, 100%. I'm part of the 53, if that can be the case. And I think we discussed this before, Gary, but I think a really good thing for us to do as leaders is to put a couple of leaders in a room and a couple of agents in a room and say, right, define for me what resilience is and tell me how we can help you become more resilient. And you'll get really different answers from the leaders and the agents. What they want and what we're giving them are probably different things. That they're resilient bunnies that just need some coaching.
Definitely. I've got a final question for you before we conclude. But if you were coming up with some top tips for future-proofing well-being strategies and making a really highly resilient workforce in a remote or hybrid model, what are the types of things you would be saying to the people listening that would help them ensure that they've got a really strong, resilient, and mentally safe team?
Shall I go first? My number one is always invest in the TLs. They have the biggest impact in this. So I would be training up the TLs before I do anything else. Invest in our technology. One of the things that makes agents, when you look at, when you ask agents what makes them feel vulnerable, it's that not having the answers and the not being able to help the customers at hand. So invest in our tools to agent assist. And those two are my biggest top. I could go on and on and on, but I would say let's invest in our leaders and invest in our agent assist.
Definitely. And Zoe, if I was to ask you the same question, what are the types of things that you think are the highest priority?
I would agree. You invest in the team leaders. They have the biggest circle of influence they are the biggest impact. And especially when we look at people choosing to stay or people choosing to go, a lot of that comes down to that team leader role. And I think you support your leaders to build resilient teams. And I think it's very similar to parenting. We don't want people to fail. We don't want people to make mistakes. And we sometimes, and I think, again, this is a generational thing. We roll our sleeves up, we try and fix. Whereas actually the leaders who are really good give that autonomy, give that space, give and allow and enable and encourage and empower and all of those words. They allow their team to really become resilient and support them, so they walk alongside them rather than hand holding or pushing and pulling. So I think that the investment, I would agree, is in leadership.
Yeah, definitely. And Marianne says one final comment here: there are many different levels of resilience attached to many different things. Agreed. Very interesting and multi-level. So I think we've just described that there is a spectrum of resilience, and I think leaders have to work with their individual team members to understand what their level of resilience is, and work with them to kind of have personalized conversations, which has been a big theme of this, is to say, right, we actually need to have personalized management. But that does put pressure on leaders and it does put pressure on managers. So I think we need to rethink sometimes the training and the investment that we put in leaders, because they are equally as stressed and they're equally as vulnerable in some of our teams. But any final thoughts in the last 60 seconds? Final comments from you, Katie?
I will. Pete Dunn just put that about the habit creation. That's a really valid point, but we'll have that fight off air, Pete.
Zoe, any final comments from you?
No, it's interesting to see the comments there. I think it's been a fantastic conversation, and I think there's lots of other conversations that could come out of that. But it's been great to be involved. Thank you.
Brilliant. And there's been some really great engagement in the comments. So thank you everybody who's watched live and participated in the conversation. I'd encourage everybody to continue that flow of conversation and share some of your top tips some of the things that you're doing in your contact center, so that if somebody is struggling, they can reach out and they can do that connection. Bit like what Ruth has done there. Thanks very much for that comment, Ruth. Such an invaluable conversation. Glad you've enjoyed it, and hopefully everybody has taken something away from this session that is practical, that they can apply in their contact center. So what remains for me is to say thank you to my guests, Katie Forsyth of Red Recruitment.
Very welcome. Thank you.
And thank you, Zoe Thompson of Phoenix Coaching. I'm going to ask you to just stay for 60 seconds more, but I'll say to everybody else, thank you very much for watching. And if you're watching in replay, thanks for watching in replay. Take care. I'll tweet you all soon. I'll end the stream.
Bye all.